Tricia is Professor of Philosophy at Washington State University and also has roles at the University of North Texas and Osun State University in Nigeria. She's a board member for Gender CC, Women for Climate Justice in Berlin, Germany, and for the Center for Research in Environment and Sustainable Development in Lagos, Nigeria. She researches in women's gender and sexuality studies and Heidegger, ancient philosophy, philosophy of technology, and various other things. So quite a wide range of interests and expertise. The title for tonight is Climate Denial in an Age of Policy Failure. So I don't think Tricia is going to be sitting on the fence about what she thinks, about what you think of COP26 and the achievements there. But you're going to give us a talk about the psychology of climate change denial, looking at the US as an example, and explore some of the logics in COP26 and how they've led to a failure to reach agreement. And I think you're going to propose a common logic that might get us further. So we will aim to have about 30 to 40 minutes, play it by ear, Tricia, of talk, and then we'll aim to have some questions, which I will attempt to chair through the chat. Thanks again for joining us. Tricia, over to you, I hope.
Thank you so much. First, I want to thank you, Paul, this, and then for all the work you've done to put this together and all the work that was done by many people today to sort out the situation. But I must tell you that you are in England when whatever happens ends. I'm quite happy for the change venue because I feel quite at home. And we're going to talk about some difficult issues today. Climate change, CC, climate change, then climate chaos, now climate catastrophe. Soon we will call it hunger and death. Not you, not me, our children. This one, great, thank you. So this lecture aims then at connections between the psychology of climate denial and incapacity of member states in the UNFCCC framework for change. To reach that will prevent the increase of global temperature beyond 1.5 degrees centigrade. And I'm going to say some things about it in a minute. I'm basically going to do 5 things or talk about 5 things. The first is establish the meaning of some, because there can be some technical terms that are often confused because they're ordinary words being used in a specific way. The second thing I'm going to do is talk about adaptation and mitigation. And I'm then going to talk about by providing a kind of case study of climate denial among the elected government officials. And then we'll logicality in climate systems or attempts to address the systems that do that in both international and national policy. And I just call that section cops and robbers because I couldn't help because it's exactly what it is. And finally, I'm going to close with of what are actually very old traditional logics that now for us are a kind of, because they've been pushed out over time and ignored. So I'm going to talk then in that section about community. So there are the 5 things. And if I run out of time, just stop me because I can send you the PowerPoints so you can look later. But I do have a tendency to get really invested in this topic. And I may talk to, if you've had enough, just tell me, and we can move to the question period. So terms then, the first one is mitigate. It technically means the reduction of the volume of anthropogenic human greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that comes from burning fossil fuels as an energy source. So ways to reduce how much greenhouse gases, the volume of greenhouse gases that is in the atmosphere. And the first one is to just stop putting them there. I mean, a lot of this stuff is really obvious and basic, right? There is to remove the ones that are there. So down below, I'm going to talk about some of the strategies to do that and which ones are absolutely quite possibly disastrous. And so we should avoid them. Although they involve a lot of cool technology that you got paid a whole bunch of grant money to research. So adaptation then, so that's mitigation. Adaptation, on the other hand, is once you've got the green and it's got consequences and impacts, how are you going to manage that? And it may not mean that much to us. All that have been happening in this country too show that our weather has become very unpredictable. You can't tell what's going to happen when. It's absolutely unusual that there should have been deaths from a flood in Germany. That where we live, there's forest fires so much now that you can't really go out anything. This year, it was from early June until the middle of September. Sometimes we come to a neighbor's house, and our neighbor's house is about the other end of this room here, which, sorry, people can't see, 30 feet. Well, I guess that's not quite that long, but it's very close, and we couldn't even. So how do you manage adaptation? Many ways. That's because climate impacts happen in many different ways. So I'm not going to go into full details of that, but I'm particularly going to talk about the impacts on women farmers in Ghana, in Africa, to give a taste of what that means for these climate impacts to be affecting food security in Africa. The term that I wanted to just define is global mean surface temperature, which I'm going to be referring to MST, and this is where the 1% or 1.5 or 4% counts. So what that number means, average temperature. Also, I'm getting that my internet is unstable, so if we get cut out, try and come back in, because we're going to set it up and come back in, so don't think it's lost if we end up disappearing at some moment.
Thanks, we are getting a little bit of background noise. I don't know if you can point the microphone any more at you and away from others, or turn up the noise suppression.
You're gonna hold. He's gonna hold it the whole time, right? So that I can. Is that better? I'm talking right into the mic.
I'm afraid that is quite a lot better. If you don't mind. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Well, this as well is also written down there. Hearing the last. So the global mean surface temperature is the average temperature of the surface water that is measured in different places throughout the planet, and the air temperature average is included in with that over temperature over the land. So the scientists originally called it global warming, and they had to stop calling it, well, they calling it global warming, but the policy people and the public people who want to talk about it, we shifted to climate change. The global warming is it opened the window for lots of people who want to deny climate change, saying a really warm winter, right? And things like that. So what we're talking about is overall the change in it. And what they're talking about, the scientists, when they say global warming, is this specific piece of data on the averaging of temperatures of the planet's water and the air temperatures over the land. So the last that I wanted to define here is global south and north. And I'm going to use those terms. Some people in global south would say third world, but I don't think that that's an appropriate term because it implies a kind of priority. Nobody likes to be second. Ask Hamilton. And third world is got a, even though it's not intended, it's got a derogatory, a rude kind of implication. And the other expression that isn't good is underdeveloped, because that all the countries on the planet should follow the development pathway that we did in the global north, and that's got us now. So in fact, these are cultures that are extremely well developed in many cases, things that we only know in the last little while. I mean, where I work in Ghana, the women know all about bambara beans, chickpeas. And where I work in the university, it's a really big deal to be working, we're out in a, so it's a really big deal to be working on garbanzo beans is what they're called there. These women have maybe grade 2 education. They absolutely understand what it means to do a nitrogen fix. And they don't publish peer-reviewed papers, right? So they have a massive knowledge for managing their agriculture that is passed down from generation to generation and has been done so, who knows how many generations that has been passed through. Global north and south, but you have to remember that when I say global north and global south, it's actually an economic category. It sounds like a geographical category, but it's economic, and it's really based on hemispheric location. But Mexico, for example, is in the global south, even though it's above the equator, and it's the global north, even though it's well below the equator. So when I say global north, I mean the world's poorer countries or the world's richer countries. So adaptation, then, we are lessening the harms caused by climate change. So in Africa, one of the ways to do it, for example, is crop selection. instead of growing millet and groundnut, you can switch to drought-resistant rice, and then you've got food to put in the child's mouth. Adaptation also, it's a post hoc attempt to live with the consequences of climate change. Crucial for alleviating climate-related human suffering. And we can talk about what will happen with climate change. It's already well underway in many places, and particularly it's very much well underway in the. So as long as I've been going there, which started in 2002, people have been dying of starvation induced by the no longer being predictable rain that comes in the rainy season. So they can't the crop that they need rainy season. So this stuff is well underway, and we need to think about it as if it's a future event. And we've seen in the last year or two, with only 1.1 increase. If this is what we've experienced in the past year, that's 1.1 dip against pre-industrial temperatures, right? Imagine what 4 is going to be like if 1.1. So we really need to stick it to 1.5 max. So mitigation, then, it reduces emissions in the north, but you know those emissions are coming from the global north, right? For example, they contribute 3.7% of total global emissions, but they suffer the consequences much more strongly than we do in the global north, because there are few resources for most of the people to be able to respond. We can get a warning something's going to happen and we can get out. In Germany, the flood was too quick for that to happen, which should really terrify us. And I'm sure it kind of does, so I'm sorry for mentioning it, right? So in Africa, you don't have those things to help you out, and you don't have cash, and you might not speak a language that's more than 10 miles from where you live because you were born and raised in the same village. So it's hard to adapt, but there are significant adaptations that, I mean, the women are so creative that they make these fantastic adaptations. You plant some trees, so when it rains, your big pond that dries out at the end of the season fills with water again. If you put plants around it that will, you know, trees that will grow up, once that creates the shadows, you have to put it on the right side in the right place, right? Which they know which to do. So once you do that, it creates shade, which allows the water to stay in that pool longer. So that's one way to adapt, but that's just one example. The other thing that we know about mitigation is it's not just that we need to cut emissions in the global north, but we also need to support development in the global south to alleviate poverty. So otherwise, if we don't help find alternative systems of development than industrialization, then the global south will simply reproduce the pathway that was reproduced in the global north, which has led to all these climate horrors, right? So this is a bit of a problem, because we can't just leave them to starve and tell them not to do something that's going to address hunger in the country, right? So the global north needs to support and take responsibility for that in order for the future to be sort of better for all of us. This is why Kyoto didn't work. And Kyoto actually isn't dead. It was a program that was supposed to do one thing and then do another thing. And so what happened with the Paris Accord isn't that they closed Kyoto, it's just sitting there not doing anything, and they just chose to take up a different path as that second part of Kyoto. So it's very different agreement than the Kyoto Accord, but it doesn't mean that Kyoto's gone. It just means that it's sitting there not really doing anything in the meantime. So once that was worked out, it was worked out with the aim of accommodating the needs of the global south, which means the global north has to put a ton of money. And it agreed in the Paris Agreement, the global north agreed that as a group, they would put $100 billion a year into, for at least 5 years to 2025, into the system. Sorry, that's more than 5 years. But anyway, till 2025 into the system in order to fund both mitigation and adaptation. And another factor that I'm going to talk about in a moment that's come out. So really mitigation is the only chance for keeping the GMST rise at 1.5% centigrade rather than at 4 degrees centigrade. Now we're at 1.1. And so we really need to fight hard, fast now. Greta Thunberg is right. This is an emergency. We need to treat it as a very urgent situation and resolve it right now in order to be able to keep at 1.5 or below. The IPCC, its 5th assessment report, which is in 2013, provided models, and that data that if we continue as we are, we're going to end up by the end of this century, which is already a fifth over, right? More than a fifth over, which I can't believe, frankly. I don't know how that happened, but right, that 4% will be where we will be at the end of the 20th century. So if you think things have been rough now with climate, just, you know, put your seatbelt on. Technologies that have been suggested. Well, at Imperial College in London, I don't know when this document, I'm assuming they're just updating it all the time because they haven't provided a date for it. And their research from one of the research centers there provided 18 climate mitigation technologies that they looked at what other people were doing and collected information on it. Replace crude oil with algae oil. In other words, run your car with that. Run airplanes with that. What can you, I mean, there are, where I am at Washington State University, they've actually introduced biomatter to be able to use it for as energy sources for airplanes and for fuel sources for airplanes. And it's still in the testing days because, you don't want to do something, and especially since that recently happened in a place in Washington State that makes a lot of airplanes, had a tragic breakdowns and crashes of airplanes that you probably remember. So we did that once in Washington State, and we don't want to do it again. Although that wasn't our university's fault, that one was another group. I'm not going to name them because then I'll be in trouble, etc. So that could be that might be a workable solution, replacing crude oil with algae oil. Another is energy storage. And that one's particularly good because it just means when you create energy, you can use it more effectively. And a lot of our energy sources now, we actually only are accessing 10% or maximum like 25% of what's coming out of the energy collection. But it's because it gets old or because it just, escapes and is lost in some way. So we can be more efficient with energy. That's good. But also it's not a proactive engagement of intervening with the atmosphere, right? It's just having better storage systems. And those are going to be the better systems because, the reason how we've got where we are is because we thought we could conquer the planet with technology, but technology turns out to be the thing that is so ultimately destructive. So you've got this thing that has turned out to be pretty destructive. Let's resolve it by getting more of it. I don't know how you feel about that, but to me that's a completely illogic. It's absolutely illogical to, you can't just fight fire with fire. Sounds like a good story, but sometimes when you fight fire with fire, you just burn more down, right? So we don't want to be guaranteed, we don't want to move in that direction. So why take risks when you can do other things that don't involve those kinds of risks? Another thing that's been suggested, and there was a mountain of people at COP26 talking about nuclear power as a transition technology. First off, I've been hearing the transition technology justification of building a bunch of really expensive nuclear power plants for at least 25 years now. It has not done, I can't say the expression because I'm being recorded, but it's absolutely, think of the word yourself, up to think that nuclear power can act as a transition technology when it has done nothing to support transition to renewables in at least the last 25 years. So frankly, that's kind of a lie. I don't think that it's true at all that it's a transition. And what it does is it takes the money that could be invested in renewables. And everyone's like, oh, renewables, they're so primitive. They're not enough. We can't do it. Well, you know what? That's what cars were like in the 1910s, right? And what happened? A bunch of money got invested in it. And then cars became something that more people could use, and it became publicized and, available to the public, right, etc. So we need to take this money that is going into these wasteful strategies and instead put them into actual positive ways of managing climate change and reducing, mitigating climate change. Is not nuclear power. We need to do it by developing renewables, which means we need not to have that money going to other sources. Sky News, just in October, a couple of months ago, made, put together a collection of suggestions. One is feeding cows seaweed. Not sure that the cows would like that, and it would probably change the taste of the cow or the taste of the milk, but that's what's been suggested. Now, one of the reasons you would want to do that is because cows are flatulent a lot, and that flatulence consists primarily of methane. Methane is only 16% of greenhouse gases, but at the same time, and this is 2021 data as well, now that we got our EPA out back, once we got rid of Trump, we got our EPA back because Trump had got rid of it. So methane is 16% of greenhouse gases, but it's 25 times as potent as methane, which means that you really need to cut back on your methane. And Biden actually proposed that at the COP Biden said, look, what we should do is we should really slam methane to reduce methane. Because if we can do that, we can buy some time to figure out how better to manage carbon dioxide, which was probably a good suggestion. But he was immediately damned in the US, and people spoke very poorly of him for suggesting that we should back off on CO2. That really wasn't his point at all. His point is we're not doing it very well, so we'd better make space for us to figure out how to do it better. We need more time to do it well. So we could feed cows seaweed, delicious insects as a food. How do you guys feel about that?
Excellent.
Do you like, what ones have you eaten?
Locusts. I've eaten locusts.
Oh, he's eaten locusts.
Yeah.
Another one? Have you? I don't know.
I've had some crickets, I believe.
Oh, somebody ate crickets? And there were places in the world where it's just like a candy, when you're walking down the street in South America, you could just buy handfuls, right? But somehow what's technically called in science in Colombia, very much in Colombia, yes. I have a cousin who goes there a brother-in-law who goes there fairly often because he's in oil, and he goes and helps them how to figure out how to program their setups to you take advantage of oil in the processing process. But I don't know. I remember as a kid doing it just to see, but I don't know. I'm not so comfortable with that one. But you know what? If I got really hungry because of the food supply being short, I'd probably be able to. I'd rather eat an insect than starve, but I'd rather not eat an insect, I guess. Cambridge University has some really good ideas. Here's one. Let's refreeze the poles by spraying salt into the clouds so that the clouds can better reflect radiation into space. How do you feel about that? Nobody actually knows what the consequences of that would be. So it is weird to do things that you think you've tested, but you've never really tested that kind of thing at its size and its weirdness and unpredictable until you're actually doing it, right? So that doesn't seem particularly good. How about greening the oceans with fertilizer? Have you ever seen a lake that's got overgrown with plants? It's completely dead. It's just soil and a few plants are still left, and all of the life that's in there. And that life is part of the cycle of the water that keeps it clean. It's part of food sources and food security, and it keeps animals as well as people going, and it just keeps the soil at a particular health level. So I really don't like these ideas that are coming out of Cambridge. So we'll see what happens with them and how far they go. And again, all the money that's being invested in those things could be invested into developing renewables. So what we need is change. Jameson, back in, note the date there, as far back as 1992, so 30 years ago, virtually now, Jameson, the philosopher, was pointing out that climate change calls for, we need a new notion of responsibility, not driven by the assumption of the locality of harms, i.e. it's not bothering me, so, right? He's really saying it needs to be more based on the cause than the impact. Right? It shouldn't be up to the people experiencing the impact. It should be up to the people who've caused things to be able to do it. So, for example, the global north is morally responsible for preventing further harms in the global south. And I think now the battery's running low. Jeff, plug. Okay, just work on the battery. And in the meantime, I'm going to close this. Is that the way? So in the global north is morally responsible for preventing further harm in the global south. And I think I'm going to just get that on a giant poster, and I'm going to stick it to the back of my car and drive around, really upsetting all my Idahoan neighbors. The next thing then to remember is that the people in the global
Tricia, you've just gone on mute. That's better.
Muted now. It's because we had to set the plug. We had to set the plug in. So people in the global south stand at the intersection of climate, food, and gender justice. And the reason why they say that is because so much of the food in Africa in particular, but also in Bangladesh and many other places in the global south, much of it is grown by women. So in the area where I work in Ghana, they grow up to 87% of what goes into people's mouths that they eat in their area. So, but they don't take it to market. So they're pretty much invisible because they don't factor in the GDP, right? Like they're not recognized as economic because they're not taking it to the market, which means they're not in the data on how wealthy the country is and what counts as a program for, combating poverty in the country, etc. At the same time, everybody knows that they are supporting the government and supporting the country, because if they weren't there growing that food, the government wouldn't be able to, they can't pay their employees enough money to be able to buy food. So they buy the other things they need to do their job, and then they go home regularly to the mother in the house who has grown food for them. So the entire economy really depends on these women growing that food, but also the lives of the children. The future for the community relies on these women for keeping the soil healthy, for dealing with, insects and things, and for providing food security. Okay, so now that it's not moving, I need to do it one more time. Once you see, and then keep on the thing there. And it should be.
That's it.
Okay. Too far. Yeah, they actually are. If you want to go back, I can close open. Yeah,
Sorry, I'm going back. Yeah.
You're going backwards?
So,
You're not. I think you're going forward.
Okay. See when?
Yeah.
See when?
Keep going, I'll tell you. So I just want to be here. So I need these ones. Okay, so what I'm suggesting is that we don't just need change, we need a just change. We need change that accommodates people's needs and isn't just about making sure that we have the best possible management of the economic system that we can have. It needs to be about people's needs and not protecting economic systems. And that's been one of the biggest flaws of the COPs from the beginning moment that it started, was that the focus is on protecting the economies. As we've seen also with COVID, how problematic that has been and how many people have died of COVID, because that's been the strategy. The strategy is we really have to protect our economies rather than we really need to protect our people. So adaptations are never going to be able to balance then the ever increasing rise in the GMST, because the only way in the end you can do that is mitigation, only putting less greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and taking out, more and more can slow stop or even reverse the climate change nightmare that we're in right now. And this depends entirely on acceptance by policymakers that anthropogenic climate change is in fact real. As long as they continue to deny it, there's not going to be any action on it, because they are the ones who fund and drive the policymakers. So there's three ways of dismissing the reality of climate change. The first is criticism of scientific evidence. Secondly, you can appeal to the benefits of climate change. I mean, if you live in Canada, you got shorter winters now. Right? You can grow your fruit in your backyard longer, right? The third is the economic threat of addressing climate change. No, but if we do that, it's going to hurt our economy. Well, 50 years from now, it's not going to matter about the economy, is it? Because everybody's going to be fighting each other to get that little scrape of ant, to eat, right? Yeah. So that's a short-sighted, BS. And I'm not there referring to your Prime Minister.
Yes.
Right? It's just a BS solution. So the Bush administration emphasized 1 and 2. It criticized, he really played on the uncertainties in scientific forecasts of climate change. And that was kind of a bit of a glitch for the scientists. I mean, somebody still needs to go and take scientists through public outreach programs and what it means to share your information in a way that's not going to get you into literature. I'm not saying lie, but you have to be able to speak in languages that people can understand in a way that they can understand. So don't get too technically tight in ways that you're then misunderstood, right? So there's the uncertainties, and also what they do is they do these models, and the models are based on, they have 3. I mean, at one point they got as high as 21, and they were like, this is too much. So they went back to having 3. So we'll try and figure out what's going to be in 2030, 2050, and 2080. So these 3 things, and then you set up if we do nothing, if we do everything we can possibly do, if we do something in the middle, and then you run it a million times through, a bazillion times through your systems, and it produces this data. And if the data says 87% of the outcomes, regardless of all those things, come out as X, we're probably headed towards X. But what the government plays off of is they don't really know, because they only know 86%, which is actually quite a lot to know, but that's all they know. So, do you really want to rely on that? I mean, give up everything, give up your warm house, which is also BS, but right, etc. So also he would play on the economic impacts of mitigation policies. So it made it very hard for organizations that want to move these things forward, because it didn't have the support of the government and of the, and you know, the prime minister. And then came along Senator James in Hofa. So believe it or not, this guy, just in case you think that people in the US have not been drinking too much water with lead in it, right? He was the chair of the Senate Committee on Environment for Bush, W. Bush, right? I mean, why would you put someone in a position like that who's about to say what he's about to say in 2003? All the phony science is contributing to the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people that threatens to destroy the foundation, the greatness. Sorry, I'm going to vomit in a moment if I keep saying this. Someone may want to read it. The greatness of the most highly industrialized nation in the history of the world, which I don't believe for one moment, for starters. But, you know, just to throw in one little gender detail here, the highest rate of maternal mortality in the global north is the US. Absolutely, right? But again, nobody cares what happens to the women, right? So he said that in 2003, and that has stuck. And there's another story about how he was able to be persuasive on that, but it's a bit long, so I'm not going to talk about it now. And he stuck with that. He stuck with that. And he tossed, when he said that, he tossed a snowball across the Senate floor just as evidence. So at least he's fun. So there's 4 aspects of climate science in new media now that we need to look at to understand what, you know, what goes on in the head. And that's why I'm dealing with it as psychology, because I think it's a logic, it's a way of thinking. And so how are we on for time at this point? I don't know when we started, so I don't know how long we've been.
Okay, yeah, no, because we started late. Okay, so
yeah, look, I mean, has it been 10 minutes or 20 or an hour? Or?
Been about 20, I think 25. So if we go for another 15 minutes or so.
Well, and sorry I talk really fast, but that's why I have to put it down in words.
It's okay, we're following.
Yeah. Okay. So the 4 factors that are about climate that, you know, that you need to look at to understand climate denial in terms of how the news media is contributing to that is the question of the validity of science, the ambiguity of cause and effect. Yeah, sure, there's a drought in Ethiopia, but you don't know if that drought in Ethiopia is caused by climate change. I mean, before we started, you know, before the hockey stick went wild, they were having, you know, a lot of dry times then as well. So you often are unable to connect those things. But the reason why I talk about Ethiopia there is because about 7 years ago now, there was a group that actually were able to prove that a drought in Ethiopia was, and a couple of other countries in the area, was actually caused by climate change impact. So that was a really giant step forward. And frankly, it's been undervalued and underworked with since then. It was a mass amount of data management, a whole bunch of innovative thinking. And, you know, I guess it's too much work for people to do who are, you know, nobody wants to fund it perhaps, right? So that's the problem with the ambiguity of cause and effect, is you can't actually connect the event to climate change as the cause. The next one is you just create controversy, because people get bored and they don't know what to think then. So if you can make something controversial, it's just a good way of getting it out of the public view. People just don't want to talk about it anymore. And then the next is uncertainty. So the uncertainty really goes back to the critique of the sciences using these probabilistic accounts, although the probabilistic accounts aren't just like they're playing craps, right? I mean, it's actually based, it's something you can take a lot of, and they're very open as well. If you look at the IPCC reports, they give you an assessment of how much the committee agreed, how strong was the information that they had, etc., things like that. So you can make a judgment for yourself if you think it's a solid assessment you can rely upon, or if it's too, you know, sort of dodgy or too risky. So these things, of course, as well, aren't really unrelated, or aren't unrelated, because if you want to set up a controversy, you just use these other aspects. You say, oh, but science is so uncertain, and is it really valid? Do they really mean that? And, you know, climate change may not be caused by humans, because, I mean, it's seasonal as it is, and that's not something we do. But also, I mean, we didn't stop the ice age, right? So you just use these things to cause uncertainty and controversy, and then people don't know what to do. So according to Antila's research, most of the articles that she examined accepted the validity of science. At the same time, though, Boykoff, working just a couple of years later, and he also was working, you know, the next citation is from 2007. So Boykoff actually found in 70% of the news media that he looked at, and he didn't choose it specifically to be biased in that direction, right? Tried to get random in his set of, in his data set. He found informational bias in 70% of the news media. as much, and he found that there was as much space given to climate deniers as there was to scientists in half of the specimens of video discussions, you know, with people getting interviewed, and paper media as well. So the idea that the discussion between scientists talking about climate change and anybody who feels like it, or anybody who actually doesn't have any training, but who has been funded and has said something on a TV show, so now can be considered an authority on it in other, you know, events and TV shows that they come onto. So they have people who aren't experts who give the implication that they are experts in the context that they're in, and they're actually being paid to support oil industries by being climate deniers. If you look up climate denial just in Google, there's a mass of, there's a couple of people who have collected masses of data on what the oil companies fund and what kind of practices they undertake in order to undermine the idea that climate change exists, that it's something that's harming us, and that it's something we should do something about. So these attributes, such as what they call balanced reporting, and this is reminiscent of the debates that we've had over the origins argument. You know, were we born on a Tuesday at 3:23 when God decided he, sorry for insulting anybody's religion, I'm a born again pagan, so I feel insulted all the time. You know, that was what was happening, right? So, you know, you're going to believe that, or you're going to believe Darwin and the, you know, data that we know going back from the geologists who have worked out how old some of those rocks are, etc. Right? So that became a 50-50 in the classroom kind of a situation, which is insane, frankly, for teaching your children. I just don't understand it at all. And it's like that now with climate change, because they just managed to balance out the volume of people who were talking about climate change. Not actually, it became a thing of two groups arguing with each other, rather than people who actually had done masses of research against those who, you know, perhaps it's like with COVID, right? You Google for 5 minutes and you know more about it than that guy who's been studying it for 40 years. Of course you do, right? It's because you're smart. So this gives the news outlets opportunity, and the explanation for the 50-50 isn't just that it was an attempt to undermine climate change. It's just that it gave you new outlets and new opportunities for engaging more people in the discussion, right? But I don't know if that justifies it or not. I think it's probably a bit of both, a bit of planning to undermine things, and a bit of it just being the nature of there being all these people available now who you could talk to, who are more than willing, and you probably didn't even have to pay them because they were already getting paid. So, etc., as opposed to other sources, right? So uncertainty remains still a long-standing focal criticism of climate science, and that means as a basis for non-action. In policy, Scott Pruitt, who became administrator of the EPA after, he has pointed out, I mean, this was reported in 2017, so it's old now, and I would hope that, you know, the EPA has changed their mind, but there's really an uncertain degree of human contribution to climate change. We know we're doing something, but we don't really know how much. So in all of this mess, it's just really difficult for the policymakers to be able to respond to it. And then, of course, the EPA after that was, you know, 2016 was decimated by Trump almost immediately when he got in there. People started quitting within the first week. Documents I had been looking at 2 days before about some stuff that was going on at Standing Rock was gone. And I was like, why didn't I download it? I'm such a fool. I just didn't know that he was going to just erase most of the online availability of data from the EPA in the first, you know, week that he was in power. It was insane. It was insane. So now then, going back to the question then, this section, so I forgot to put the number in the front, but the question here is climate eligibility in international and national policy. And this is what I've called cops and robbers. And I'm going to start with national policy then, or sorry, international policy. So I already mentioned about the missing, it's technically known as the missing $100 billion of annual global north monetary commitments. And so for 2 years, the countries in the global north have not made any payments of the promised $100 billion collectively. It takes one to start, because all the rest are like, well, I'm not going to put my money in if they're not going to put their money. Sometimes I feel like it's easier to teach grade 3 students right? I mean, it's that level of logic. Well, I'm not, if you won't, we'll all do more than you'll do, but you know, I mean, it's these sort of weird arguments that you think people would have grown out of well by now. So COP21 in Paris, that was when the $100 billion US dollars value per year in commitments to support the global south for mitigation, adaptation, and this new category, loss and damage. So loss and damage became a new thing. You don't just have to worry about mitigation and adaptation now. Some of that sometimes you cannot do the adaptation. If you're on a small island state, you are now being engulfed by water. I had a 16-year-old girl say to me, you know, I'm 16. I've known that beach pretty much every day in my life. And I know that the water's coming in, and other countries have offered that they will take us when we need to move here, because it's not just that you can't live there. It's like, I mean, it's not just bang, one day you're underwater, right? It's the water comes in more and then it goes out again with the tide and it comes in more. So the first thing that happens is the salt gets into your soil. And as you know, that was what the Romans did to get rid of the cultures they didn't like. They're like, well, we're going to soil the sand. We're going to salt, thank you. We're going to salt the soil, and then you're not going to be able to grow things anymore. So the first threat isn't actually drowning, it's starvation, right? So she said, so at that point we'll have to move. But you know what? When I get there, I won't be surrounded by a community that is my people. So I won't be speaking my language very much, and I won't be eating my traditional foods or I probably won't be doing my traditional dances. And she looked me straight in the eye, it's giving me goosebumps. She looked me straight in the eye and she said, I'm the walking dead. And this was more than 10 years ago. And since then, there are islands that have had to, you know, the people have had to leave because they can't live there anymore. And often there are island groups. So some of those islands are still, you know, people are still living there, but they all know that they're going to have to go pretty soon, you know, as well. So loss and damage is when adaptation is not going to be able to make it. In other words, loss and damage is now you got to pay the price because you haven't been doing the mitigation. Right? This is what loss and damage is. So you really got to put this money in. So where we are now, well, the money for clean energy, so supporting development of clean energy approaches in poor nations, that's almost at $100 billion a year just for itself. Never mind that it's supposed to be these three things that are getting funded. When you look for adaptation, it's at $20 billion a year, and that's expected to double by 2025. So then they're, you know, quite well into getting towards 100 billion, especially if it's supposed to be for all three to be combined. So what do you get when it comes to loss and damage, which was only invented as a category in the Paris Accord, so in 2015. So it's new, but it's not that new. That's 6 years, right? You got a 6-year-old, that's kind of loud voice. So for L&D, it's hard even to get it on the negotiation agenda or get any aspect of it on the only place where it's welcome is in the women and gender constituency, where we really want to talk about these things. We want to talk about indigenous peoples and impacts, and we want to talk about loss and damage. So loss and damage is about providing money. Right now, all the money that they have in places is their own money, which they use to go around and assess the damage, but they don't have any money for repairing things. So COP26 then, the G77 plus China, so that represents 85% of the world population and 130 countries. At COP26, they were strongly, so 85% of the world population, their representation was pushing for discussion and moving forward on loss and damage. They were in fact asking for the COP26. Their main goal was to get the COP26 to establish a loss and damage facility, because what you need to do in a COP is you need to get your feet on the ground. And once your feet are on the ground, so they have to pay attention to you every year now you can actually do the stuff that you want to do and not have to spend all your time at the COP just trying to get them to sort of let you back into a way that you can be part of the conversation. And we had that for a long time until Mary Robinson and the woman, I forget her name, who was the leader of the UNFCCC at that point, they got together and they got pushed through in Doha an agreement on gender. And there's been previous agreements on gender, and it's been like, oh yeah, well that's really good. Yeah, we've got an agreement on gender now, but it didn't have anything fixed in it, so it never got carried forward and nothing ever happened. So what happened with this one was they demanded that there be a gender day. So the Tuesday of the second week is always gender day. And also it's required now that every year when the COP meets, there has to be a discussion of the gender issues. So there's a regular meeting. And once you've got that kind of fixed reality of something, it has to happen, and it can't really be easily taken away. So that was really advantageous, but that hasn't happened yet for loss and damage. And so that's why they were pushing for that, because if you had a loss and damage facility, you would have a concrete fixed thing. So you could actually just go ahead and actually start working on that now, rather than trying to get it back into the conversation every year. So that was a good step, except for Alex Sharma, who's the COP26 president, left it out of the draft text. So at the end of it, they came out with the draft text, and he had got rid of that, the proposal of a loss and damage facility. And he blamed it on the US and the EU for blocking it. Sorry, that's F, there should be an F there, US, EU for blocking instead of technical assistance. You know, that was what they replaced it. That the discussion of loss and damage facility somehow became something talked about in terms of technical assistance. I don't know what that means. I don't know how they got there. I don't know how that's supposed to work in that function, but that's what happened. So it basically was just completely shut down in a very irresponsible way. The EU and Kenya, actually, Kenya and other countries in Africa and a few other countries in the global south, actually were arguing, however, that we need new financial mechanisms for adaptation and for loss and damage. So I think that they may, you know, the claim that EU was blocking the damage facility, the LND facility, may not be accurate, right? Because they were also very much pushing, but sometimes different representation of countries don't have consistent, you know, approaches, right? So that happened. And then the global south, and in this case, I mean really the low income countries, and there's ones that are low middle income that would, you know, that are global south still, but we're talking about the low income country. They feel that it's absolutely a moral right for them, for the global north to give money. Global north money comes in to support them in managing loss and damage, because they are the cause of it, right? Like, they've caused it, so they owe some money to sort it out. At the same time, though, the EU and the US are reluctant, and the reason why they're reluctant is they're afraid that if they agree and say, yes, we did, and here we will give you some money, they feel that they'll be absolutely overwhelmed very quickly by unlimited liabilities. And I think that they quite as well might be. And I also think that that would be incredibly just. I mean, I don't see that as, doesn't mean that they would pay it, right? But I mean, there's a justice to that, right? It's not like it's a small, yeah, okay, we'll give you $100,000. I mean, it's not like that would be resolving it, right? Too much has been done to damage. So it really is a problem. Well, what are we going to do? Like, what are we going to do? Not just for it to be avoidable or affordable, but for it to be just, right? So climate illogicality then in international and national policy. I'm going to talk now about a couple of more things, and then I'm going to talk about, I'm just going to use Ghana as a sample, and then there's just sort of a where I want to go with all these things that I've been told that I'm telling you. So we should be about another 10 minutes tops, something like that. So Kenya pointed out in response, so at the end of the event, each country has this opportunity to make a statement. And Biden's actually was quite interesting, because he got up and he said over and over again, the global north is letting down the global south, and we need to stop doing that. He doesn't actually represent the view of many of the people that are in the United States, but I think it's really important that he said that, because even though the US was out of the system for a long time, and when they were going back in after Trump was gone, when we were going back in, everyone was saying, and now, you know, the United States is going to be the leader of fighting climate change. And I was like, just get over yourselves, right? Because you left and now you're back. So don't think you're coming back as the big boss, right? And remember back when you were on Tahiti, and was it Tahiti? It was an island state, and the guy who was the local guy running it stood up and said to the American representative, if you can't help, get out of the way, right? Because we all want to make change. It wasn't Tahiti. Oh, sorry. So in this opportunity to say something, what Kenya said is, our trust is shattered. We have 2 million people facing starvation right now due to drought that we, you know, because it was one of those countries with the one I talked about before, they were able to have proof that it was climate caused, the drought was climate caused. 2 million people facing starvation. And so our trust that you're ever going to do anything for us is absolutely shattered. Tuvalu, which is, I mean, they call it literally sinking, but they're actually being absorbed, you know, overwhelmed as sea level rises. We're literally sinking, and it's a matter of life and survival for many of us. And Tuvalu is one of those places where there's a collection of small islands and that constitute a state. And so those are the first climate They call them the first climate refugees, but there actually isn't an official category of climate refugees. The refugee policy of the UN High Commissioner's office doesn't have a policy on that. When they tried to have that, they were absolutely slammed and shut down because, you know, the United States didn't want anybody mentioning the word climate change, the phrase climate change anywhere. So now they do what I do, because in the US, I can't do lot by saying climate change. So I just talk about food security, because it's, you know, you can just change the word, just take out climate and put in food security, and you're basically saying the same thing. So that's what's sort of happening in these discussions quite a bit. So the UK, no offense, but the UK actually cut aid to climate hit countries just before COP26. Wouldn't have been better if they'd done it after or something, but that does seem a bit, it's not showing a concern. It's not showing us empathy, so it's a bit awkward. Nicola Sturgeon, who people love and people hate. I happen to be one of the people who love her, so sorry for you that don't like that. So on November 12th, it actually was my birthday, she was doing a talk, so I went and got to sit like right in front of her and hear her say things. And she said that, look, when L&D was first, the fund was initiated in 2015, Scotland immediately put in £1 million. When it was announced that Scotland it was going to be the 2021 host, they added another $1 million. And this morning, she said, today, we decided we'd add another. So we're at 3 million at this point. I thought, wow, that's absolutely really rocking. Here's the thing. Scotland's not a member state of the UNFCCC. They're not a country, right? Technically, UK is the country. So, you know, a location that is not actually a country, that is a member state of the UNFCCC, of the United Nations, is putting money into this. And she said, we're doing it, and we keep upping it here because we think that other places need to copy us. Other places need to get motivated by seeing what we are doing. So maybe there will be some money, but frankly, £3 million is not a lot when you're dealing with the countries and the things that they're facing, right? So what's wrong with it at the COPs then? So the first real problem here is that the governments are negotiating for greenhouse gas reductions, right? And other things, but it's not the governments that necessarily need to change, right? It's the corporations. It's the oil companies, the sources of greenhouse gases, the ones that continue to put them into our world. Those are the people that need to be making the changes. So people who are trying to argue for change are actually the wrong people to be doing it, right? So of course it's going to be problematic and not be able to get anywhere because it's not actually well pointed at the problem, right? There's a bigger force, and I think it is. I think that, you know, multinationals are a bigger force than governments at this point. They run the world in a way that governments don't. So if you want to understand the globalization of capital, you should watch the film. It's from 2001, so 20 years later. It's an amazing film. It's called Life and Debt, and it's actually about the globalization of Jamaica. And you see how the Jamaican industry is just absolutely eliminated because of a globalization. So just one small example is when they started this globalization process, and they had to agree to the global, the president is in the film, and at one point he's virtually crying because he said, look, what we had to do was we had to sign this agreement to globalize, which means to put your money out for, into the system that allows monetary exchange, right, for exchange values, right? So they did that. And so they immediately had a whole bunch of people come in and start selling powdered powdered milk, and there was a thriving dairy industry there, but this powdered milk was really cheap, right? So everybody started buying the powdered milk because if you're living there, you're probably not very rich. Also, there's the marijuana cost of living there. So, right, they everybody bought that, and so the dairies went bankrupt. Well, after the dairies went bankrupt, unexpectedly, the price of the powdered milk went up, and now nobody could afford to buy it. But there were no farms to go back to, no dairies to go back to, because they'd already been bankrupt and destroyed. That's how capital works, right? And there's a whole section on the special area. Countries now in the global south have a special area, which means you can go and dump your stuff there. Their factories will turn it into what you want, and then you drive away with it. And if you're lucky, if you can afford 1 egg a week, there's a woman in that film who says, if I'm lucky, I get to afford 1 egg a week to give to my child so that he can grow up with bones and be strong and have strong mental capacity, because you need protein for that too, right? Etc. Right? So it's absolutely a destructive system. And also the guy who was, you know, they were speaking to the country, and also they had done interviews with the leader of the World Bank. And what's the name of that guy in The Simpsons who owns the factory?
Oh, yes.
Mr. Burns? Yeah.
Mr. Burns.
Guy who was the head of the World Bank at that point looked exactly like him. It was really creepy. I thought that maybe the cartoon was based on him, or the cartoon come into life, or what, right? So anyway.
Sorry to interrupt for a second. I think we've just lost the speaker, the microphone. Robin, you haven't turned it off by mistake there.
No,
It's on.
it's on.
That's better.
Okay. Yep.
That it? Okay, you all right? Oh, too bad.
Back on.
So you missed my Simpsons joke. So the UNFCCC is a consortium of countries trying to reach agreement, oblivious to the fact that they have no power in the face of the multinationals. If you look at it now and think about it seriously, governments, in fact, have become at best a tool and at worst the weapon of capital. And if you think that's an extreme claim, look up, write to me and I'll send you a paper on the murder of environmental protectors, people who mostly in the global south are protecting the land that they use to grow their food and their access to water, never mind the loss of their traditions, etc. And often what happens is the government gets a big contract, they want to build a dam or something, there's a lot of local protests. The people who are running the dam building don't want to lose their contract, and the banks want to make a ton of money of it. The members of the banks are also, the people who own the banks are also in the government, and what they do is they support these paramilitary or ex-military who go out and do hits to take down these people who are standing in their way. And the ways that they do that for women are different than the ways that they do that specifically for men, and it's absolutely horrific. So this is true. Governments have become the weapon of capital because they've been, when I talk about cops and robbers, these are the robbers, right? What they're doing is they're robbing people's culture, food, water, lives, families, communities, and they're doing that in order to make profit. And it's a coalition of countries from the global north who know or do not know what's going on, banks, governments, and ex or quasi-military or would-be military people who are prepared to be, the ones who actually take the action. And usually when they are arrested, there's people in there, like when Bertha Cocaras was killed, of the 9 people that were involved, 4 of them are actually either active or past military. So that is absolutely a true statement. So COP26, week 1, as usual with the COPs, there was a lot of great promises. Canada promised that it was going to get rid of the oil development in the oil sands in Alberta, where I grew up and where most of my sisters and their husbands are actually in the oil industry, so we don't talk a lot at dinner parties, right? Trudeau promised that they would get rid of that, which I'm shocked by because it's been there forever and it's still absolutely useless. And it's killed a range of land that's so big that if you get in a plane and fly over it, it takes a good 20 minutes, something like that, at least. It's massive. And that was indigenous land, which has been destroyed now because it's just completely covered with oil and sand and not covered with anything that you can't grow there much anymore. Nonetheless, that's one of the biggest promises I've ever heard. I'd never thought that I would hear in Canada a leader say that they were going to get rid of that thing. That was the promise. Many promises were made. Some really good ones came out of the global south, starting from youth groups in South Africa. They said that they were going to get rid of coal mining, which is a really big deal down there. And that's a surprise too, right? But these things, I never heard anything about the Trudeau claim after that. And of course, they did what they always do in the second week, which is they actually get down to the economic argument. And once they've got that economic argument, they're lost and nothing's going to happen. And the way they were talking in the first one, the promises were bigger than they've ever been. So it failed now, but maybe that will open the space for the next discussions. But I don't think that it will, because as long as in the end it becomes an economic discussion, it's never going to get anywhere. So that first week of reason converts in the second week. So the first week is the one where they care about the people, where they want to make sure their lives are saved, etc. And it becomes the week of capital that doesn't frankly give a what the word is about that particular consequence, right? So climate change then isn't an economic issue, it's a justice issue. It's a distributive justice issue. Some people have to suffer more, harms from climate change while others get more benefits. Some people pay, the price when others make profits off it. So distributive justice, how much you suffer from climate change versus how much you can get. Given that the global north is creating the problems, but most of the impacts that are hurtful are happening in the global south. So there's a distributive justice issue. There's an intergenerational justice issue, because it's not us, it's our children and their children, if they are able to have them, who will be able to, who are being harmed by this. It's gender, because it impacts women in a very different way that it impacts men, especially when they're the primary food growers for their families. It disrupts food sovereignty by not allowing crops to grow or the food to be the way you want it, etc., to grow, and a million other kinds of environmental justices, including biases, etc. So, let's look. So let's look at this final point on international policy then. We've got human rights issues, we've got ethics issues, we've got human suffering issues, and the whole thing's being treated as economic issues. So remember in Hofer, remember the guy who's, in the US Parliament, in the US government, who who's the climate denier? By 2015, so he said that in 2003, in 2015, he's been funded almost $2 million by oil industries. Oil subsidies in the US are still at $4 billion annually a year. You think they had put that, if that $4 billion went into renewables, where would we be now? Big oil then protects its interest by undemanding public acceptance of the reality of climate change and its impacts. And Monbiot was doing that in his book back in 2007. This is not stuff we don't know, yet it is allowed to continue. It just continues and continues. I'm starting to sound like Greta Thunberg a bit, right? We know what the problem is. We know what's being done to keep the problem being even worse of a problem, right? And really nothing significant is being done to make those changes. This is Exxon, just what Exxon alone itself has done, allegedly, is support cyberbullying of scientists. And the reason why it took so long for the third assessment report to come out is, the guy was interviewed later by a new scientist. And he was saying, look, I was getting death threats. I was getting death threats for my kids when they were saying where they knew where their school was and stuff, right? Like, it was really hard to get that thing to happen, the third assessment report, because anyone who was in a position to actually make it move forward was just threatened and threatened and threatened. And, in the end, you want to save the world, but in the end, you want to also save your family, because, it's a job, right? You shouldn't have to sacrifice your family or yourself for your job. Funding public relations strategies that undermine confidence in climate. Funding organizations that show reckless disregard for climate science, and exploiting the complexities of climate change by emphasizing the minor issues, by manufacturing false claims, and by holding conferences to promote non-peer-reviewed research as if that's actually a perspective that should be widely understood and held to in the global north. So what about nation states then? Well, Africa is the only example that I'm going to use, and it's going to be Ghana. Africa's been incredibly hard hit by climate change. By 2007, at least 1 in 4 people in Africa are not getting food, not getting any food, at least 2 days a week, which means it's repeatedly throughout the year, which is a definition of extreme hunger. And also Africa was the only continent that didn't achieve its Millennium Development Goals on poverty. So the big challenge for Africa is trying to, achieve the Sustainable Development Goals on poverty by 2030. So if you look at Ghana, it's caught in poverty, hunger, and it wants to meet its, promises with respect to this and the goals of the Sustainable Development Goals. So if you look at the first one, it's about poverty. So how are they resolving poverty? As is the case in much of Africa, they're doing it through oil production. So they discovered that they had oil in 2007. They first produced it in 2011. It goes directly into tankers, so it doesn't come onto land in Ghana, and it ships off to Norway. They actually are only paying them about 60% of what they should be paying them for the oil. But it's this phrase in Africa for discovery of oil or other kinds of replete resources is whether it's a gift or a curse. Is it a curse or a gift to have discovered this? And in many ways it's both. And the money also doesn't seem to be trickling down to the individuals. The other thing you want to address is hunger. How are you going to do that? Well, you've got these women subsistence farmers. And I told you that 87%, where I work there, so 87% of the food what goes into people's mouths is grown by women. So the women feed the family. They're not going for the market. That's why there's subsistence. Why they're called subsistence farmers. They're economically invisible, but at the same time crucial for meeting food security needs, as I already discussed. In the Upper Eastern region where I work in Ghana, women grow as much as 87%. And the impacts are drought, flooding, sporadic, unpredictable rains. And the trouble with unpredictable rains is you can't necessarily grow your crop. So typically you would grow millet, which is that's a major grain there. It's full of protein and calcium. So the protein gives you good bones if you're a kid growing up. The calcium is good also for the bones. The calcium is for the bones, and the protein gives you brain development, and it also gives you muscle development. So when you see a kid in Africa with the twig-like arms and the big swollen belly because it's affected the liver that is now bloated, you know that they're not getting enough. They're not getting enough protein. So this is the impact of getting insufficient protein. But at the same time, you've got to feed them something, right? Groundnut, which we would call peanuts, is also high in protein. But the mothers are moving to drought-resistant rice because you can't grow millet. If there's not rain every day, the millet doesn't grow as well. And at the end of the season, you don't have enough to last to the end of the year. And groundnut's even worse because you plant it, and if it doesn't rain consistently for the first 3 to 4 weeks, it grows. But when you pull it up at the end of the year, I mean, they're called groundnut because the nuts actually grow under the ground, right? When you pull it up, there's no nuts there. So you just wasted all that energy and all that time. So what they do is they've, got some help from a couple of funders. And so they buy this they get this drought-resistant rice now. But of course, rice has almost no nutritional content, and it certainly doesn't give you protein and calcium in a significant way. So what they're doing is really just having something to feed their children that's going to give their children, they're sacrificing the nutritional value just to avoid starvation. But those children are going to grow up with, if they survive that long, to the long-term impact of not having properly formed bones or brain development and muscle development, right? So they're stuck with it. So how can Ghana possibly meet the Sustainable Development Goal on poverty using oil and expect to meet the second Sustainable Development Goal on hunger, because oil causes the climate change that is destroying food security capacity? It's ill logic. It's just completely sick logic. So what are we gonna, how do we need to think about, what kind of psychology or psychological brain state, thinking state, idea state can we create that allows us to understand these things such that we could stand in a place and have a different kind of a plan that then perhaps could be shared more broadly? And I just want to send a shout out here to Extinction Rebellion in this country. That was one of the most beautiful things that I've seen to work against climate change. And I know that everybody, were any of you guys involved with that? I know you took a lot of crap for that, but I thought it was done absolutely brilliantly. And I think the only bigger impact has been Greta Thunberg than the impact that you guys had all over the whole planet. So what I wanted to suggest, and I just was hoping that a bunch of people who've been involved in that would have come here to talk about the psychology as a logic of capital. So the psychology of climate denial and of not doing anything about it is a logic of capital, against which I want to propose a logic of care. So what does capital tell us? It tells us these lies that people are lazy and greedy. My experience is they're not. I imagine you guys work your butts off. I certainly work my ass off all the time. And I know lots of people that do that. And these women farmers in Africa, they work hard. I cannot believe how strong they are. None of them are fat, right? They just work so hard all the time. They average 10 hours a week more labor than their husbands do. And, these are not selfish people who are lazy and greedy. They just want their families to survive and do well and be happy and be safe, just like what the rest of us want, right? So the purpose of the other lie of capital is that the purpose of human life is the individual accumulation of private wealth. Of course, it's not. We're not here to get rich. What are we here for? I don't know, but it's certainly, I can tell you as a philosopher where everybody's asking me what's the meaning of life. I'm like, well, it's not to get rich, right? Most of the rich people on the planet seem to need to take a lot of drugs just to get through the day. And I'm talking, not the nice ones you get in the news stores, but right? So I mean, for goodness sakes, right? So it's a psychology then that justifies corruption and justifies exploitation, because the name of the game is to succeed, and you succeed by getting rich. And how do you do that? By exploiting your employees, right? You know, Boses is like, oh yeah, well, I gave them a $5 an hour raise. And it's like, well, you make more money in a minute than you'll be able to count if you start now till the rest of your life, right? So, I mean, it's silly to think that we're supposed to think it's a good idea that you give them another $5, and which is actually, I think, more than he gave them for an hour, right? I mean, we're back to the BS, right? So it is exploitative, and it demands. It's not just that it approves of and supports; it demands self-thinking. So I blame with this on 19th century philosophers who invented the idea of the individual and the human rights. I'm sorry. I'm averse to the idea of human rights. Why is that? Because human rights depend on there being this particular thing that is the individual who is the carrier of those human rights. And what I'm really going to tell you here is that we are not. We are not those separated out I's, right? This is the strategy of the I. The strategy of the I says me, work for me, work for me, work for me. But really, so there is basic justification. I'm going to get back to that. The basic justification then is this term survival of the fittest. And who's the fittest? The strongest. Well, I think that that's BS. I don't think that that's what it means at all. And I don't think that that's what it means in the Darwinian account either. Thinking that it's okay to be, the strongest because we should admire you for being able to survive because you're the fittest, that's just bullying. It's just bullying. It's childish and it's fascist. What are we supposed to be in contemporary globalization? Wage earning voters? No, we're wage earning consumers. That's probably the best brief description I can come up with what we are intended to be in the global north now. And we put our kids in schools and we train them to be that. So I was teaching environmental ethics in one place, and there was a woman giving a talk about a particular policy that someone had it's called deep ecology. She was explaining it, and she said the first thing and the second thing, and there were like 7 principles. And at the end I said, do you agree with all those principles? And she said, yeah. So I said, so do you think that you're in this, with this group now? And she said, oh, no, I'm a business student. Right? And a guy in the room put his hand up and he said, isn't it crazy that all those things all describe what we felt like, what we believed in when we came here? And after 4 years of education, they've taught that out of us. We have lost what was our moral compass. We have been taught against it to believe someone else. And I was pretty shocked by that. But I was like, oh, he's right? Like there's something to be truthful in that. We have to teach our children to not want to do something other than capital. And I think we need to absolutely do something different, because we aren't born as this I. We are born absolutely interrelational, right? The mother knows that because the mother actually is a part of her body, admittedly parasitic. But nonetheless, guys were supposed to laugh at that, but you're all horrified by the other things that I'm saying, right? So, we're connected to mother in a particular way, also father, siblings, teachers, neighbors, and it's only derivatively that we become the individual. So we should see ourselves first as not individuals, and as Aristotle would say, only in thought. We can think ourselves as individuals, but right now I couldn't even be talking to you if this guy wasn't holding this up and hadn't done this, and if my cousin hadn't come to see it, and if we weren't working together in something, we wouldn't be here doing this. It's absolutely fundamentally every moment, every day in the human experience, and that's why many of those rich people need to take all their drugs, because that aspect of being human has been deprived of them in so many ways because of their public figure, right? So there's a sort of a lot to think about there, and it's a lot to change. But as long as we keep understanding capital as an economic issue, we're never really going to get anywhere with capital, because we can't get rid of capital, right? I mean, money's been around for a long, long time, but capital hasn't. You can get lots of different accounts of what makes capital capital, but I would say what makes capital capital is, it's like a 19th century novel written in relatively close to here, I believe. The point is that it's, no, I sort of lost it. Give me a second. Oh, I lost it.
19th century novel.
Yeah, I was thinking about the novel and I totally lost what the point was of it. Okay, yeah. So we think of capital as an economic issue. So in that particular novel, what happens is the person doesn't want money to X, to do something, wants the money for the money. Once you start wanting the money for the money, that's capital. When you want money so you can go and buy a banana because you want a banana, That's just buying something. But when you want to collect money just for the sake of collecting money, that's when it's left that realm. It's no longer about human needs and it becomes about a desire factor. And it's a desire of money for the sake of money itself. And so that's what, I forgot what the name of the book was, but that's what was in the book. So it's become a teleology. It's money for the sake of money. It's got a telos. It's got a that for the sake of which you're doing things for the sake of accumulating profit rather than having a kind of life of thriving or promoting lives of thriving for other people. It's all about your collection of the profit. So what would be an alternative to that then? Well, I mean, first we got to think about, ethics etymologically comes from ethos, and ethos is what defines and structures a community. So ethics isn't always doing the right thing. In some absurd, ridiculous way, Nazism is an ethic because it's a set of laws and behaviors and practices that define a particular culture, right? And this is why Kierkegaard made a distinction between the knight of faith and the ethical, because the ethical is to play your community's game, right? Then ethic is what structures a community. So what we really need is an ethical shift to communities that are not structured by capital, because really that's what capital is, right? It's I mean, we all treat it as an economic category and it's taught as an economic category, but really it's how our world is structured. If you don't have that cash, you ain't coming in here and getting that beer. You're not living in that house. You're not living in that part of the country, right? It's actually structures the cultures and the communities that we live in now. It's structured by capital. And, I see how you're sort of looking at me because maybe it needs a bit of thinking about it. So I mean, when you think about it for us, that's actually what capital does for us. Right? It's not just about money exchange. It's about setting up the world in which we live right now. It's an ontology. It's what things are in which we live. And one of the things that comes with it is cost-benefit decision-making. And we all know, the story of the trolley, right? You got a trolley coming along, it's going to run over 10 people. You can pull a thing and then it'll just kill the one person. So the moral thing to do is just have the one person die. Well, not when it's my son, right? I mean, why do we have to have that? Why can't we just have, there must be a way that the train doesn't kill anyone. Right? Like there isn't even an assumption of that now. And the other problem with cost-benefit decision-making, which of course is fundamental to capital, is it's this utilitarian principle, which is what that trolley story is about explaining, right? Is utilitarianism, the greatest good goes to the greatest number. But once you start thinking about it, you realize that good, what does good mean in there? The greatest good to the greatest number. You have to decide what the good is before you apply the utilitarian calculus of what's the most and what's the least, which means utilitarianism has nothing to do with ethical values. It just has to do with providing a calculus once you've already decided what your values are. But because the story is that utilitarianism is an ethical method, which is, when you teach ethics, the first thing students want to know is, isn't utilitarianism a method in ethics? And I'm like, no, they try to tell you it is. But what's happening is it's getting covered over that you don't have to consider values. The value section, by thinking that the method isn't deciding on a value and then doing the numbers or finding different solutions where you don't have to decide who's going to die and who's going to not, right? Other sort of more, what I would call moral or ethical or at least reasonable, well-to-behave kinds of ways, right, has to already be decided for you. So recognizing that, if you can come back to the idea of value, it stops looking like utilitarianism is a way to make ethical decisions, because the ethical decision is actually in a value decision, right? And then you're applying it. So if you think you can skip that, you're just erasing it, and you're never going to make the right, it may be randomly, but you're not often going to make right choices when you don't have a way of, overcoming that, like of actually taking space to figure out what your values are and what the values are at stake. New logics, however, which are actually old, long-standing traditional knowledges, I'm proposing what's called an ethics of care. No, I'll go the other way around. So it's an ethics of care. It's well known to be a feminist thing, but it doesn't have to be feminist at all. And for me, it's ecofeminist, but it's actually not about women. Historically, care practices have been gendered. It's been the women's job. And for some weird reason, because I have a vagina, I'm apparently really good at unpacking a dishwasher. So that's my job, right? In the kitchen. Those days they're not gone, but they're certainly going, right? those gendered care practices don't need to be done by me. You can have this change going on, but there's a normalizing and a mainstreaming of labor that's been gender segregated. And now we're getting back to the idea that anyone can do it. You too can unpack a dishwasher. I can also change my oil in my car. I mean, right, this breakdown of labor activities is a movement that's underway, and I would hope that it would grow more. There are cultures. My son's father is from a culture where they don't have pronouns for he, she, so their separation of labor is really interesting. The father spends so much time with the kids. They just want to be with the kids all the time. And if you indigenous groups in North America have pointed out how when the chief is talking to a particular group that want to do something on their land, and then some kid walks, a very small kid walks over and he picks it up. People have written about how that changes the attitude of the white, usually male people who were there to do the negotiation with him, because he instantly drops in their value system when he picks up a baby, because I guess that's not what real men do or something, right? It's not that they're even aware that that's what they're doing. So, there's a lot of stuff going on around gender with respect to labor. But the truth is there are many things that anyone can do. And you don't have to call yourself an ecofeminist to do ecofeminist stuff, right? You can just do it. So what do I mean by care then? I don't mean that it's like some kind of special gene or whatever, an emotional drive. And so this is the last part. It means rather, I'm kind of neo-Marxist. So what I mean by care is a labor activity. So for example, daily reproduction of the material conditions of daily living. That's a care practice. So I don't think women are caring for their children. And I mean, there's lots of women out there who are quite happy to say that they don't like to cook and that they really hate the idea of having children, right? I mean, it's not an unknown thing, right? But, there's also lots of women who will spend their day, and especially in Africa, spend their day doing the things that they need to be able to feed the children, clothe the children, get them to school, etc. Right? So that's what care is. It's what your labor assignment is. And at some level, you have to, want to take it on or have it forced on you. But it's a labor practice, not about bodily essentialist bodily identity, right? So it's not so that care then, it's not for money, but it's about meeting family needs. I mean, when I feed my son at the end of the day, I don't say, okay, I need $5. Right? You do it because it's a care practice. It's meeting your family's needs. So women subsistence farmers in Africa, they have a livelihood, not an income, and they grow for care. They don't grow for profit. They grow for care for their family. So I'm going to skip that because I had a bit on non-binary gender and rejecting it, but I don't need to include that here. And so this gives us a completely other conception of what survival of the fittest means then. So for me, survival of the fittest in Darwin means survival of a species because it has a functional ecosystem fit. For example, it's kind of playing well with others, right? Like, you're a part of the ecosystem, whether you sort of actively choose it or not, and we have a tendency to actively choose it to sort of be the bosses of ecosystems, right? But to work in an ecosystem in a way that provides the good balance with the ecosystem, that's survival of the fittest. It's about your fit, the survival of the species, because it has a functional ecosystem fit. It's a kind of playing well with others. So think about the, the little dung animal that rolls around on its big thing. The dung beetle collects, its little body of dung and rolls around with its wife on the back of it, right? Well, that's providing the service that is useful for the other animals that are living in the ecosystem, right? So if you can fit well in an ecosystem, the species can go on forever unless there's something absolutely catastrophic, like getting hit by something coming in from outer space or something, right? So that's what survival of the fittest means. It doesn't mean being the strongest. It means being the best fit to be able to contribute knowingly or unknowingly to the community that is the community with around us. So what does that mean for climate change? It means, we're unsure, I'm unsure anyway, that the UNFCCC is capable of resolving climate change. It's too embedded in climate change as an economic issue. And it's, that's also why sustainable development is actually an oxymoron, right? Because it's become so embedded in the capital approach to understanding what that is, rather than the human development and human, safety and food security, etc. And they're also not addressing the single most factor of corporate practices of capital. I mean, that's the factor that needs to change, is how oil companies behave. And, the CC is driven and sourced by the fossil fuel industry that largely impacts international finance by underwriting capital exchange. And there's a lot to say about that, but I'm not going to say any of it. So what would be necessary then for there to be change? And when I first say this, you're going to think that it's completely unrealistic. But if you think about it for a while, you're going to see that it could be possible if we change our logic, if we change from a logic of capital to a logic of care and stop thinking about profit and values and how well corporations, how impossible it is to change that thinking, because it's not a reality, it's a thinking, and therefore it can be changed. How to change it, I'm not sure I know, but I got some suggestions. One would be that the UNFCCC should be pressing the UN Human Rights Council and Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights to recognize those in climate-driven forced migration as refugees. There's a lot of them out there. 80% of them are women and children, and they cannot call them that because they weren't in the original category of it. And when they wanted to put that into the category of definition of refugees, all the anti-climate people just slammed on it, and they couldn't do it. So now they're sort of doing it in these backward ways where they talk about a nexus of issues, and that they can't grow their food anymore becomes one of them, etc. But until that's fully recognized, the actual impact of climate change on the global south isn't recognized by the global north at all. But once you know the data on that, it starts to get overwhelmingly clear to you that it needs to be addressed. And one way to address it is first and foremost to recognize them as refugees, so they can have the rights and protections of refugees. And that doesn't sound like much. If you're 15 and you're female and you are in that group, you are going to have a horrible time, an extremely horrible time. You will be sold, you will be played with for a few days and dumped somewhere, and you will have to walk back to the camp on your own. This is a common practice. I'll send you the data if you want. Recognizing them as refugees will give them greater protection such that they can be saved from that. Also, they need to press member states, and this is the part that's actually most radical. What do these member states need to do? First off, they need to recognize that gender is more significantly than they are treating it a crucial issue in CC. Women actually have so much of how choices are made about what we eat, about when we use power, what we use it for, and I mean like energy, and what we use it for when we turn the lights off, when we keep them on, etc. The women's pattern of driving cars is different than men's typically, etc. So we need to know a lot more about that. And I'm actually vice president of an organization in Germany that teaches a lot of city councils about that, but that's important. But here's the stuff that starts to get radical. Abolish the corporate charter. It doesn't have to exist. And as long as it's there, corporations are absolutely protected. They, form a sub-company. They do a whole bunch of oil drilling or some other kind of resource exploitation, and then they just leave, and there's a big mess. And you can't sue the company, but you can sue the little sub-company, but it's already defunct. So sorry, bye, right? They're gone, and they've destroyed a place, right? This is common practice. I'm sure you know about it. End that by getting rid of the corporate charter so that the corporation leaders can actually be held responsible for this. Another thing you could do, you could fill that loss and damage by obliging corporations, which means here the shareholders, because shareholders make a lot of money off of these things. It's not just the companies that, once they're in the stock market, right, the shareholders are making money off of these things. Why not oblige them to compensate for the damage for which they are profiting? And then also, sorry, I'm just the very last part. Okay. Hold corporate leadership in the fossil fuel industry responsible as well and liable for the direct consequences of their profiteering. In fact, I believe that they should be reported to the International Criminal Court under the Rome Statute, because the Rome Statute does allow that. It's not just about genocide. Which is also a kind of thing that's going on with all these starvations that are happening, with the food security crises in Africa. These organizations know how people are being harmed, and they just go out of the way to not be affected for it. In one area of the US, a pipe broke, and they just let it pour out into a river for 5 days. They could have come earlier. At the end of the 5 days, when it was convenient, they plugged it up. That was that. That river was useless now for at least 2 years, all the way down the river, right? For 2 years. You couldn't fish, you couldn't swim, you couldn't take water out of it. and until it had sort of purified itself, right? And but you know, it's okay because they got like a $4 million fine. So because they're traded on the stock market, they have to provide public access to their economic data. So I went in and I searched, and that amount that they got, that $4 million that they had to pay for this is their punishment, was 0.01 of that year's budget. They don't care. They just pay the bill. Right? They just pay the price. And they shouldn't be doing like that. That is not stopping them from doing what they're doing. So it's completely useless as a practice. And everybody thought $4 million is a lot of money. So they were really punished, but 0.01% of their actual budget for the year wasn't even big enough to be pocket change for them, right? So, you know, the International Criminal Court can actually act on those things. So they need to have it put there. And since 2007, I've been calling it negligent genocide. And you know how negligent homicide works. You know somebody's going to die, but you just walk away because you can't be bothered. That's negligent homicide. Negligent genocide is, you know what climate change is doing. You know how people, there's enough literature about it everywhere. There's enough people like me whining about it, right? You know that there are these challenges and you just don't react to them. You just pretend that they're not there. And most of them are in the global south, which means most of them are not white. So I see it as negligent genocide. So closing statement then, what climate denial did was normalize the issue in the public mind. That was harmful to moving forward on climate change, and the UNFCCC has actually strengthened that normalness by having all these meetings and never doing anything about it. It's become something you just hear about. It's not anything you really bother about any more than you bother about whether or not, you know, your dinner is going to be hot or cold by the time you get home, right? It's like a thing, but you don't take active steps to change it all the time because you're just so used to hearing about it. So that's a really big problem, is the normalness, the normalization of climate change. What has the Framework Convention on Climate Change and its COPs achieved in 26 years? Every year since the meeting in Kyoto, emissions have grown, and the Paris Agreement hasn't slowed emissions down either. They've been talking for 26 years about this, and every year the amount of greenhouse gases created has been higher. And the interesting thing is going to be, I mean, the 2020 data, I don't know yet, right? Because there was so much less people driving to work, right? Greenhouse gas should have been the first year that it went less. I'm not sure if it did. And if it did, I'm thinking 2021, right? Because we can't have our economies destroyed by COVID, but actually we were getting our ecosystems back. You know, you think of those big cities in China and how much trouble they have with pollution. And 2 weeks was all it took, 2 weeks of COVID. And that was gone. It was gone, right? And we think it's impossible to get rid of that because it's there every day. But what's happening is it's pretty much getting created every day, right? So you can actually get rid of it. And we don't have to change anything. We can have warm houses. We can go out and have beers and pubs. We can do this and do that, right? We can do all the things that we used to do. We just need to do them with a different energy source. It's that simple. But of course, the oil industry doesn't want to do that. They've got so much money invested in it. They don't want it. They want to just eke it out, right? Because you're not going to be having that forever. They're going to eke it out, but we don't have enough time for them to eke it out. If they eke it out by balancing, right, they'll do that by what? You know, the end of the century, and by then it'll be too late. I mean, we need to do everything we can, absolutely right now. So sorry it was so long, and thank you for the interesting drama of starting the event. And I'm really happy to have been here, and I'm happy also to take some questions. So sorry for taking up so much of the time.
Thank you so much, Tricia. I didn't want to cut you short. I thought it was a fascinating and kind of complete, I'm sure it's not complete, but you know, a fantastic kind of overview of your thinking on ethics and government and climate change. I know that we've gone quite a bit over time, and I know also you've got a group in the pub with whom you'd probably quite like to be chatting, but perhaps if we could just take 10 minutes and see if there are a few questions online I can send to you.
I have a hand up actually here already.
Paul, do you want to go first? And I've got a couple in the chat as well I can go
actually,
to next.
We have a hand up here already, so should we just do
that's
that
Paul.
one first? And then...
That's Paul.
Okay.
Paul, can you unmute?
It's not Paul.
No, actually in the pub.
In the pub.
Oh, a real hand. I'm sorry.
Paul.
I hadn't realized there were such things as real hands involved. Yes, hand up with you. Go for it.
Did you want to come and talk in the question into here so that everyone can hear?
Oh, I can do it. And it's just a short one. I just wondered if you thought that the prevailing paradigms of psychotic.
The question is whether the existing power systems, you mean like governments and things?
Yeah.
They're psychotic?
Internationals and corporations.
Yeah, well, they're actually, there is a film made by a Canadian woman that took all of the criteria that psychologists look at to understand if you're psychotic. And it turns out that corporate practices match those. So the answer to that is yes when it comes to corporations. I think for people individually, it is a kind of it's a problem of groupthink, right? People think what the group around them thinks. So
I think it's extreme dogmatic rationalist rather than actual psychotic, because psychotic implies delusion. I think it's sociopathic.
Yeah, well, I'll take sociopathic too, but I mean, there is a lot of delusion in it. Yeah, our governments are quite delusionary, I think.
Okay, I think I stand corrected.
But, you know, we don't all have to have the same, you know, I mean, I think we basically agree, right? It's a question of terminology and specific details, but either way, the answer is yes. You know, the answer is yes. Thank you.
Can I just ask a question? Sorry, Nick. You're really sort of talking about an empathic shift, almost towards the aesthetic and the humble and the anti-consumerist approach, yeah? What do you think can actually bring that change about from the psychotic, dogmatic, rationalist, capitalist, predatory, selfish, individualistic nonsense to something more empathic and social?
Well, I mean, I think in the end, it all goes down to education, you know. I mean, if you think, okay, well, someone goes into grade 1 and they start getting educated in a way that isn't training them to be capitalists and wage earning voters, etc., right? If you do that, you're never going to get any change because you've already done the indoctrination. And it's not that the way that we do things now is neutral. It's always everywhere going to be always already an kind of indoctrination, and there are better and worse indoctrination. So why don't we start teaching climate change issues when kids are in kindergarten? And I actually do stuff with kids in kindergartens on climate change and, you know, in the early years of school. And you can't terrify them because they're little kids, right? But you can certainly say things like, you know what, you don't have to listen to your parents. And then the teachers all go, oh, what? And all the kids stop, you know, because they're 5 or 6 years old. So all they do is run around. Instantly, they all stop and they just look at you. And you say, when you leave the room, you can turn off the light. When you go to school, you can tell your mum you want to walk or ride your bike and you don't want to be driven in a car there every day. And I think it would take 20 years, right? 30 years. We've had all these years now and we haven't got anywhere. You have to change the minds. And you can't necessarily, it's really hard to change minds that are set, right? The older you are, the harder it is to have your mind change. So we really need to start teaching it at younger years. And I'm working with people in Nigeria who are doing absolutely that. They're like, we need to, and Nigeria, you know, Nigerian oil, right? So you know all the stories there. So that's what they're doing now. They're working to teach their children right up through universities about how to live in a world where you don't follow the logics of capital and the practices of capital. So maybe that's the only way it can be done.
Nick, over to you.
Thank you. And for the online audience, we do understand if you need to drop off and have a rest at some stage. But if you do have a question and would like to share, please post it in the chat or put your hand up. And I'll go first to Paul Fletcher.
Hello, Trish. Sorry I can't be with you there tonight. I'm very jealous that you're actually in a pub at the moment. I'm not.
Well, I wish you were here. Thank you so much for initially inviting me.
Oh, it's the COVID thing has caused lots of problems for everybody, I think, at the moment, me included. One of the questions I wanted to ask is, in this country, I don't know if you've heard of Mariana Mazzucato.
No.
Mariana Mazzucato has set up a primary public financial institution for green innovation called Puffin, which aims to influence the activities of public sector financial institutions towards climate change environment for green transition. I can send you the details of that through. Now, that all sounds well and good, but I was really influenced by how you changed the terminology regarding climate change in calling it, I think you called it like a food crisis or something like that. And I wondered how we can get from that big financial sector, I know you've mentioned education, down to people sort of like in the street. And I think your method is a more direct way of actually making them connect with it. Have you got any other ideas upon that at all?
Of how to, well, I mean, I think that they need to not be free of all kinds of responsibilities, right? I mean, if you make them free, if you make them responsible for the consequences of their profit making, you know, that, I mean, they're doing well with it, right? So if you can do that, that's really what changes things. But there also is a movement out there to make sure that businesses are, you know, I mean, not everybody who's doing it just wants to do it for the money. I mean, they have other values as well, right? So this balance of making sure that you're serving the community, that you're serving your employees well, and that you're serving the atmosphere well. You know, these three sort of pillars have been put forward, and it's been at least 20 years now that there are those movements, and there's more movement towards them. And of course, the oil industry is moving, you know, as well, right? It got rid of the electric car, crushed it in its early days, but now it's happy to sort of work with that, because one of the strategies that they do is whenever an effective technology or process or corporation or anything comes along, they like to buy it up, and then they just keep it so that they can let it out when they want to let it out, because it's beneficial for them financially at that point, right? So there are all these kinds of movements, but the truth is, as long as they still remain in the logical capital, they're never going to be able to introduce the factor of justice. Capital doesn't admit of justice, right? It's not in its way of thinking. So, and we're talking now about extreme capital, right? We're not necessarily talking about its early days of anything. We're talking about the consumer culture that we live in now, right? It is not designed at all to protect the environment, right? So when stockings were first invented, you could put them on, and I'm not saying this because I'm that old and know in person, but I've read about it, right? So the stockings would last for ages, and it quickly became that as soon as you put them on, you get a run in the first. I mean, I haven't worn a stocking for ages, but you know, when I did, one of the reasons I stopped is because they just bust all the time, you know, and they get these terrible looking, you know, runs in them, right? And that was actually fabricated, because they don't want you to just buy one and then have it for 2 years, right? It's same with cars. We're constantly being advertised that after 2 years we need to get a new car. No, we don't. Not unless you sold me a terrible car in the first place, right? So this idea, it's not just that you have to buy, it's that you have to buy again and again and again. And it also promotes this image of everybody has to be young, thin, tanned, rich, happy, giggling, dancing, and the world's just not like that either, right? So if you create those kinds of visions, and then people, as the norm, you normalize them through advertising, and then people don't live up to those things, they feel left out, and they feel harmed, and they feel as if something has been stolen from them. I think that's one of the reasons why there's such a high incidence of mass shootings. I mean, other than actually just the having guns problem, there's all these really unhappy people in the US, right? I mean, they go around and do things like that, but you know, they don't have health care that isn't going to bankrupt them if they do something serious like get in a car crash or get cancer, right? And they're not living a life that is the life of this vision. And as long as you have that, you have the I again. You don't have the we anymore. You don't have the company. You have the, you know, the community. You have isolation. And so movements that work towards, like something like Meals on Wheels, that's actually something that can attach people back up to the community, and taking these people who are alone, who feel lost, who feel left out, who feel abandoned, and not having been able to live the promise that they were given. I mean, white privilege, it's one of the white male, no offense, but it's one of the real problems of white male privilege, right? White males grow up with this vision of what their life is going to be like, and the world has changed now. The black guy may get the job, or you know, etc., right? So there is this massive feeling of loss, and that has to be dealt with. I think bringing cultures back into, you know, the global North culture doesn't have the indigenous culture that still understands how special it is for it to be in a place, because we just move around all over. You have a girlfriend, you lose a girlfriend. You have a boyfriend, you lose a boyfriend. You have a car, you have a this, that. We just switch and change and move and this and that, right? And that means that we don't have the kind of fixity of needing to respect our environment as what we depend on to live. And until we can get rid of that idea, the capital idea of conquest, right? Until we can get rid of that, nothing's going to change. You know, you always ask the best questions, Paul, and you always ask the hardest questions. And, you know, they always have the longest answers. So sorry for taking so long, but thank you. That's such a great question. And if you have any ideas, I'm pretty sure it's going to involve kittens, but you should, which I totally agree with and admire you for. And we should, I'd love to talk about these things with you further. I was hoping that you would be here and we could have a beer and just continue talking till the wee hours or something, but it looks like you're not here. So maybe next time.
Thanks, Tricia. We do have a few more questions. We've got a couple of questions on the oil industry, which I'd love to get you onto. But we also have a really thoughtful question from Marion, which I can read out from the chat. And it's about, you know, timing and practicalities. Do we stand any chance of realistic change when pursuit of political objectives are so short term and underpinned in most or, you know, many cases by personal gain? Do we actually have time to educate the younger generation? And she's glad to hear about the use of empathy being a valuable emotional response to the need to make people understand there's no planet B. So I guess the question from this, as I see it, is, you know, you're calling for some quite radical changes of thinking that might take decades or even longer to bring about. And you're also saying we don't have time to be doing any of this. So how, you know, what do we do this decade or this year?
Well, I mean, I think we have to start by changing the school system. And yes, it's going to take decades, but there's been decades. I mean, the first proposals that we should do something about climate change was in the 70s, right? And here we are now, 50 years later. So basically, it may be the fastest way. So even if it's not, you know, even if it's too far away to have it be 30 years through education of children, that's still likely going to be the fastest one we're going to be able to do, right? Because how else are we really going to be able to disrupt the practices of capital across the planet, right? So I think we have to make time. We have to have the time to do that. And it may really be the only out. But my hope is also that over that time, this will bring more change, right? Because children go home and they say things to their parents, and their parents also need to help them with their homework as they get older and the homework gets more complicated, right? So it's also a way of teaching adults. Adults can learn as well. And nothing changes a person's mind like having their child tell them something that they need to respond to with respect to the care for the child and how the child respects them. I mean, I often get told by people, oh, well, I'm sure your position is very good and all that, but you don't really believe it's true, do you? And, you know, and then at the end they'll say, oh, I'm sorry, I had to make these arguments against your view and all this. And, you know, because I've just sat there looking at them the whole time. And then I go, oh, I didn't think this, I stole it from Socrates in the Symposium. I said, oh, don't worry. Well, another version of it. Don't worry. You haven't argued with me at all. You're arguing with your grandchildren. And they usually go, and there's, you know, because they have not thought of it like that, right? They have not thought, because somewhere in them, they know that there's something going on with it, right? I mean, you can't completely think that climate change is an actual thing. You just, I mean, I don't know, maybe you can, but I don't think you can, right? Especially now that we're seeing so many symptoms of it. So I think between the changes that are happening and over a shorter than 30-year period, it's just, it'll take that long for them to be the ones that are running the governments or moving into them or running the corporations or etc., right? But there used to be companies and they weren't capital the way that we're capital now. They weren't so greedy. They weren't so grab it and run. So maybe there is possibility of change. And I don't in the end really think that there is possibility of change, but that doesn't mean that I'm not going to fight for it. I believe with, you know, I'm with Sartre, abandon all hope and then work for change, right? Don't start working for the change. You don't need hope to do that. And the trouble with hope is it's like a Monty Python scene where the guy's in the ditch saying, you know, knowing it's not going to work is easy. It's the expectation, it's the promise, it's the hope that's killing me, right? I don't know if you've seen that one. He ends up in a monastery. Yeah, that's what he says. He says it's the hope that's killing. The entire film is ridiculous, but that one line, it's the hope that kills you. That's crucial, right? Because as soon as your hope is crashed, you stop doing anything about it. So give it up, forget about it. You're never going to make any change. Now get out there and work for some change, right? That's the best we can do, right?
Fantastic. Thank you. I'm going to maybe wrap things up online at 10, but maybe we have one more one more question or a couple of questions from Freddie.
And I just wanted to thank Marion
yeah.
for her comment on empathy in her question as well.
Yeah, we also had a note from Anne about your ethics, and probably worth at least another whole talk on that in future. So perhaps we can invite you back at some stage to hear a little bit more about ethics of empathy. Thank you. Question from Freddie was, I guess
does oil well go to production in Ghana? How can this be reduced?
And why do oil companies need subsidies? I guess need is a loaded word there, but why do they get subsidies, and what's it doing in Ghana?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not entirely going to corruption. It's not a fully, I mean, Ghana has a lot of small corruption. You know, they stop you by the side of the road at a little thing and you give them a couple of dollars and then you drive on, or you want to get a driver's license and they just sit there saying, soon, and you have to give them $5 and suddenly it'll appear. There's a lot of that. But at the higher level of governance, it is a country that tends to be really concerned about the well-being of its people. So it's not entirely corrupt. I'm sure there's some corruption that's definitely going on up there. And one of the problems is it's kind of an enclave industry. So it's hard to get information about it. And they just keep to themselves, and they don't want a lot of critiques that typically go. And I mean, that's standard behavior in the oil industry globally, is not to want to get out any information that you don't have to give out, right? So, you know, there is that. But one of the problems they have is that they're so overwhelmed at this, you know, windfall of finding oil and getting all this money, that they poorly negotiated how much they've been selling the oil to Norway for. And so they've only been getting about 60% of what they should in relation to the regular amount. So I'm sure that they're working on that. But when I point out this business to them about the clash between their oil policy and their policies that are also trying to help women farmers and other farmers to be able to grow enough crops, they just laugh and think that it's silly. I don't think they've really thought the logic of it and put it together, because there's no reason to believe that that particular oil is hurting that particular crop, right? But at the same time, it's still part of it. It's hurting crops somewhere, and etc. Right? So that is a pretty big one. But I don't think that they're specifically corrupt. But if you look at the history of, if you send me an email, I have a paper from a while back that I wrote with a Nigerian colleague, because, you know, I'm a research fellow at Osun State University in Nigeria. We got together initially to do some research on oil in Africa, because he was a protester when he was a graduate student there against the oil practices in the Delta that have been going on since the 1950s, that have destroyed people's homes and livelihoods and poisoned their children and etc., and ended up in the late 1900s by the hanging of Ken Saro-Wiwa and the Ogoni Nine. He was from the Ogoni cultural group in the area. And so there's a lot of wrongs that have happened there. And there's still a lot of young males riding around in boats, because it's, you know, the Delta's got a lot of water. So they're in these boats and they're proud to stand at the front with their assault rifle and have, you know, their eyes showing and their bandana, you know, across their mouth or whatever. And so what I argued is that they are, against the will of my co-author, I wrote that they are basically the same as the oil companies, because they're just opportunists, which is what the oil companies are. And so now I can't go to the Delta because they'll be mad about it. And was there another part of the question as well?
Well, I can't answer a question on the ethical side of things. Freddie was wondering what you thought of Rawls's veil of ignorance thought experiment as a way of encouraging an ethic of care. Would that help us or set us back?
Oh, I think that it would be great. I mean, that's one of the best ways to create a balance, right? I mean, when you have imbalances, there are usually more and more imbalances as you go out from the core, right? So to be able to take a chunk off the top and put it on the bottom would make a really big difference. Most of the women that I work with in Ghana live on less than $1 a month, and the World Bank doesn't have a category of poverty for that. The lowest category is living on less than $2 a day. So imagine living on less than $2 a day being the lowest category, and then living on $1 a month. So, but the thing is that they basically have their own economy, right? Economy doesn't have to be based around capital. They have their own way of doing things and trading things. They trade a lot of labor. You know, I'm going to go work the field, so you look after my kid, and then I'll look after yours when you, etc. I mean, they just do a lot of, they do labor trade-offs that are really effective, and they just live in a very different way. And they've been doing it very well that way, very successfully for a long, long time. They are not poor, pathetic, helpless women. They're very innovative. They're absolutely resilient, and they work their butts off, you know, and they are really dedicated to what they do. But the thing is, climate change is changing the wet rain patterns, and the changed rain pattern is harming them. But, you know, people think that, oh, well, we'll just go in and save them. It's like, don't go in and save them. They can save themselves. Just stop killing them through creating climate change impacts, right? I mean, that's the solution. You know, so there's a whole bunch of stuff there about justice entangled with it as well. And one of the things that's often forgotten in the UNFCCC is that this is justice issues, right? And as the UN, that's what they should be prioritizing, the justice issues, not the economic issues, right? I should think that's in their mandate, pardon the expression. Their person date, I don't know what we call it now.
Absolutely, remit, yes, absolutely. Thank you, Tricia.
That's
been a fantastic, mind-opening, mind-expanding talk from you. I think we're going to leave you to continue the discussion in the pub with those who are there in person and get a top-up drink. Thank you so much for making it all work somehow. I know it wasn't easy. And thank you to Paul for the invitation initially, to Tricia, which has certainly paid off hugely for us, and to Robin for somehow making the setup work. And thank you to everyone for being so patient and bearing with us.
Brilliant. You did it very well and kept it going throughout.
Like a challenge.
Well, I'm sure we'll come up with something in January. We are going to be online, but we will aim to break our way back into the OSO for those who want to be there in person. We'll take our crowbars and everything else. So that will be 11th of January, and we're going to be talking about the ethical ramifications of our general ignorance about whether artificial intelligence could become conscious in the future. So that will be interesting. Yes, Paul.
Nick, can I just say, if it's pantomime season, I'm allowed to say, oh no, you won't.
Yeah, you may well be right.
Setting up for Peter Pan in the USO. They're setting up for Peter Pan.
We're going to do our best. Anyway, thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and a real pleasure to hear from you,
Trish.
Tricia, and to talk to everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
It's been wonderful.